So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benishi Albert. I am Yuchi and Anishinaabe, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Climate Justice Alliance. The Climate Justice Alliance, a national alliance led by and directly accountable to frontline communities. We're right now 89 members strong across the US, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Turtle Island. And I just want to thank you all for being here and joining the webinar today on just transition and climate action strategy. And today we're going to be focusing on climate policy. So this is the third in a three-part series. And this will be maybe not the last one, but it'll be the last in this particular series. And want to make sure that we thank our sponsors for helping us with this series. So Donors of Color Network, Edge Funders Alliance, Environmental Grantmakers Association, Justice Funders, National Committee on Responsive Philanthropy, Neighborhood Funders Group, Rio Collaborative, Solidar Network, and Women Donors Network. So you all know, but we are living through some really extraordinary times right now, and dealing with crises that are both predictable and unpredictable, but are impacting and directly impacting frontline communities. And that ranges from the diminishment of our rights, and the predictions that result in the recent Supreme Court hearings, both to women and to communities, to increased violence and racialized violence, gun violence towards our communities, and to the stressors of the ongoing pandemic and what does that mean for our lives, to increase climate disasters, to wildfires, to escalating storms, and also dealing with the propensity of false solutions that continue to dig, burn, and dump in our that continues the dig, burn, dump economy. These are all unrelenting threats to our community. So at Climate Justice Alliance, we've been working in this dual strategy of fighting the bad and building the new. And this is how we've been working to build the power and build power with communities for decades. And so in this series, we want to bring together and continue to lift up frontline voices to share with us their political understanding and how a commitment to just transition and systemic change moves us from an extractive economy towards a local, living, regenerative economy, and an economy that comes from and directly supports our communities. So in this series, we had the first section was about just transition and the history of the EJ and the environmental justice and climate justice movements. The second session that we did in this series was how members are working towards building regenerative economy in their local communities, with examples around like community-owned solar, worker-owned cooperatives, agroecology work, food production, and relocalizing food systems and non-extractive finance models that support just transition, and just transition, safe and affordable housings, and lots of other examples. Today, we're going to be looking at the role of grassroots organizing and passing climate policies that work for frontline communities, and also organizing to fight against false solutions, which are popping up more than ever in the state and federal policies and international climate talks. There's been lots in the news. I'm sure many of y'all have been following recent developments in Congress, but there's lots happening right now. So we want to hear today, we're going to be hearing today from 5 powerful grassroots leaders among our memberships, and excited that you guys are going to be here to listen to them. So right now I'm going to pass to Khan, who will introduce herself and get us started.
Great, thank you so much, Benishi. I'm just going to wait for my slides. Hi, everyone. My name is Pham. I'm the state representative for Oregon House District 46. But today I am going to be talking about this local Portland Clean Energy Fund ballot measure initiative, as well as how this campaign helped us develop our statewide Oregon Just Transition Alliance, and also some of the recent legislative victories that we've won, because both of these local and state initiatives are really contributing and helping us build our grassroots movement for a just transition here in Oregon. So first of all, a little bit about who I am. As I mentioned, I'm a state representative in the Oregon legislature. But before that, for over 2 decades, I have been a longtime community organizer, most recently with Apano and Opal Environmental Justice Oregon. And I helped to co-found the Oregon Just Transition Alliance, which is a member of CJA. I also work part-time as a senior strategist at the Just Solutions Collective, which is a movement support organization that works to deepen understanding of equitable and effective policies and to help build the capacity of communities to implement justice-centered solutions. Next slide. So PCEF started, or the Portland Clean Energy Fund, we call it PCEF. It started because to address this central problem that we kept bumping up against as communities, where BIPOC communities, low-income communities are being hit hardest by climate disasters. And we're also being excluded from the jobs and the opportunities, investments, and the cost savings that come from this transition to a renewable and green economy. And so in trying to organize, our communities have a lot of ideas for the kinds of projects that we want to see, whether it's job training or home weatherization projects, energy retrofits. And yet we just keep being told like, that's a great idea, but we just don't have the money. And so we set about to try to find a revenue mechanism. So the Portland Clean Energy Fund is a 1% business license surcharge on retail companies that make at least $1 billion a year nationally and at least $500,000 in local Portland sales. And we collect that money, which is about $60 to $100 million in annual recurring revenue. And we put that in a fund called the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which is dedicated to projects that will create green jobs, healthy homes, prioritizing frontline communities. And we grounded ourselves in this. For us, the Just Transition Framework was really formative. We're really grateful to CJA for introducing us to this framework and movement generation. But really, we're trying to draw down the money and power from these large multinational corporations and really making sure it's more within the hands of local communities as we try to divest from this really extractive economy and really invest in the regenerative living economy that we desperately need. And so if you kind of look at that, the bottom, the values filter by which we want to be spending our money and divesting from their economy, we really wanted to make sure we're shifting economic control to local communities, really centering racial justice and social equity as a part of that, and really trying to democratize wealth and who gets to make decisions about what investments are made, and also hopefully advancing ecological restoration as a part of that. So I don't have time to talk a lot about the intricacies of the campaign, but I did want to just share the real grassroots nature of this campaign. It was the first time any of our groups, which were all community of color-led groups in partnership with some grassroots environmental organizations, none of us had ever really led, at least I can speak for the community of color-led groups, had led a ballot measure initiative before, at least one that was, I guess, maybe I won't speak for forever, but at least in our, in our cohort of people that started out doing this, we didn't have a lot of experience, but we did have was an approach that really centered. We made a commitment to ourselves that we were going to really center frontline leadership in the strategy, while also recognizing that we would be in partnership with what we called privileged capacity organizations, like Audubon and Sierra Club and 350 PDX, who had some more volunteers, who had some more time, and were able to lend some of their volunteer capacity, but the strategic leadership decisions were really held by the steering committee and the executive committee, which had a majority of community of color-led orgs. So Even though we didn't have a lot of funding, with very little funding and very little electoral or ballot measure experience, we were able to win because it really forced us to, the lack of funding and the lack of experience really led us to build a really unique coalition structure that challenged, I think, traditional notions of how campaigns are supposed to be run in this really top-down kind of centralized way that's really dependent on a lot of paid campaign staffers. Next slide. So really quickly, how it works is the city's revenue division collects the surcharge from all of these billion-dollar corporations, and then they put it in a designated fund called the Portland Clean Energy Fund. And you can see there the pie chart breakdown of how the money should be spent. And then a 9-person committee of Portlanders who reflect the racial, ethnic, and economic diversity of our city goes through all of the grant applications and makes recommendations to City Council about which proposals they should fund. And so you can see that 40 to 60% have to go to energy efficiency, renewable energy. They might actually be shifting out of these percentages, but our vision was to really show, job training and apprenticeships, a real pathway career pipeline is really important for women and minority owned people of color workers really need that career pipeline. And then a portion to go to regenerative agriculture, green infrastructure. And now we're shifting to potentially transportation as another bucket that can be funded. Next slide. So on election night, we were really ecstatic that despite our lack of funding and despite our lack of experience, we were able to pass it by a nearly 2-to-1 ratio. And we went up against some of the biggest, as you can see, some of the biggest corporations in the world. It was one of the few climate initiatives that actually passed in the nation that year. Next slide. And so now we are getting into the fun part where we are actually giving away the money. In 2021, we had our first round of funding. It was smaller capacity building grants, a lot of them, in recognition that a lot of our groups need like planning and some capacity building to get ready to be able to carry out these larger projects. But this year, we approved $110 million in funding because these billion-dollar corporations actually did much better in the pandemic than even we were expecting. And so our fund actually reflects that. And so we were able to give grants to we funded 65 different community-oriented projects that address energy efficiency, renewable energy, green energy workforce development, and renewable agriculture. So it includes major home upgrades like $9.4 million to Hacienda Community Development Corporation to help replace gas-powered heating, and 243 apartments for low-income Portlanders. We gave $7.2 million for Constructing Hope, a pre-apprenticeship program. It's just going to train almost 600 low-income women and people of color in green energy construction trades, and so many more. It includes a heat pump and air conditioning program to help low-income Portlanders adapt to the now recurring heat waves and heat dome events. There's so much more to go into, but it's really it's just game changing for our groups, which had never had the opportunity to build our capacity in this new realm. And so more importantly, I do want to say that it also helped us to build our electoral and our movement building muscles. So we were able to gain confidence in our own experience and our skills to really start to look at, okay, how do we take this to the state level? And so the Oregon Just Transition Alliance really took a lot of those frameworks that the PSAF model introduced about frontline leadership and privileged capacity support orgs. And we, in 2020, we actually went on the road on a statewide listening tour, which we call the Oregon Green New Deal Listening Tour, to really hear from frontline communities across the state about what was their vision for Oregon in the next decade or so. And overwhelmingly, people talked about the need to dismantle racism and white supremacy, which has a deep, long-rooted history in Oregon, while also investing in resilient communities and communities that are in a just recovery, communities that are already experiencing the climate change impacts and need to be a part of this clean energy transition. So we wanted to make sure that our communities were also benefiting from the jobs that were being created. So you can see some of the themes that came out here. And as I said, it also built our, we were starting to think through, I was starting to think through as the director at the time of OJTA, how are we going to actually pass this at the state level? And so in January of 2020, the state rep for House District 46, my predecessor, announced that she was going to retire. And so that experience of the Portland Clean Energy Fund gave me the confidence when people asked me to run. You can flip to the next slide. To actually throw my hat in and run a campaign very much modeled after using some of the same grassroots decentralized structures that we had for PSEF, to run my own campaign for state rep. And I was able to win against the former Multnomah County Commission chair to represent the southeast side and the east side of Portland. And so I would not be here today if it wasn't for that experience of learning how to run a campaign, electoral campaign. And then now being able to work on the inside with the same coalitions and alliances that I used to work with on the outside. So you can, next slide. So you can see here that some of the same work that we did with the Oregon Green New Deal, we continued. We had an Energy Justice Leadership Institute across the state with many of the same organizations you might recognize in the Portland Clean Energy Fund, but now moving statewide because a lot of BIPOC communities live in rural Oregon too, and are really starting to, we articulated a vision for what it would look like, what energy affordability would look like as we make this transition. So we were able to pass, you can flip to the next slide, 3 really powerful policies as a part of the Oregon Clean Energy Opportunity Campaign. The first one is the Energy Affordability Act, which allows utilities to set a low-income utility rate for low-income Oregon households, and the Healthy Homes Bill, which moves $10 million for home repair and weatherization, which is critical for building resilience for frontline communities. And last but not least, our 100% clean energy for all bill, which is the most aggressive clean electricity standard in the country, setting a standard of emissions-free energy by 100% emissions-free energy by 2040. We had over 170 participants across the state doing part of this Energy Justice Leadership Institute. And it was successfully passed in 2021. And you can see some of our members, even behind the governor right there, signing as part of this bill signing ceremony. So I know that we have limited time, so I will wrap it up. But I just wanted to say that, I think I have been so grateful to the movement generation and CJA for really introducing this 3 circles framework about how our communities really need to be grounded in what we need. We can't always be just waiting for just reacting to what is being introduced, but we really need to make sure that we're really clear about our vision and then working to push the window of what's politically realistic towards what our communities really need. I'm happy to stay here to answer any questions, but yeah, we're really excited to be part of CJA and building movements that are developing new leaders and really have the infrastructure to seize these moments and demand the systemic changes that our communities need.
So we're passing on to Maria Lopez Nunez, who will join us next.
Thank you. And thank you to Climate Justice Alliance for inviting us and having us. This is such an important discussion to talk about grassroots organizing and policy. And I'm Maria Lopez Nunez with Ironbound Community Corporation in Newark, New Jersey. And I think in terms of grassroots organizations, Ironbound is as grassroots as it gets. We were not created to actually deal with the environment at all. We were created 53 years ago as a childcare center, right? So when you think about what's at the heart of community, we were created by women in our neighborhood who needed access to reliable childcare so that they can continue going to work. We were creating shortly after the Newark Rebellion. It was a exciting political moment in the city where residents were really feeling empowered, like they could take back their city. from those that had dominated and kept neighborhoods like ours at the margin. So how does a child care center end up becoming really a force for organizing? Well, in the 70s in our neighborhood, things started exploding. So you could see in that corner, we had hundreds of residents who started marching for the right to clean air, because our community, we've always had a community advisory board who leads our organization and dictates our priorities. They realized that no matter how much we invested in childcare and health vans, that there was a systemic issue affecting our neighborhood, a systemic issue that needed to be solved, right? And that happened because there was explosions in our neighborhood. Our neighborhood is 4 square miles, but we're host to 3 power plants, the longest Superfund site in the country, which is the Passaic River. And that's from during the Vietnam War. In this country, we were creating Agent Orange, right? Well, that Agent Orange had a byproduct, dioxin, that was being dumped into our river. So, when we poison other people, we also poison ourselves. But in this country, we poison those that are most vulnerable. And so, that Superfund site, the explosions, they were all coming to a head. And that's when we created the Ironbound Committee Against Toxic Waste, which later evolved into our work doing environmental justice and standing up for our community. Since then, we've had the pleasure and the honor of being part of alliances like the Climate Justice Alliance that help us really learn from other communities. And that's, I think, one of the strongest parts of grassroots organizing under alliances like CJAs, that we get to talk to each other and learn how that policy affected that community, how that policy might look when it hits the ground here. We've been subject to experiment. All communities are subject to their own different types of policy experiments. And I think that's why it's so important to involve us in policy making, and why actually funders need to push themselves to fund directly to organizations that have the on-the-ground experience of what policies, what their lived reality is. Because when you're in a think tank, you don't live in a community that's going to be impacted by the decisions, by every word that you write. It's a different, it's just a whole different thing. You can get really theoretical. And we saw that in New Jersey through the passing of the country's strongest environmental justice law, the Cumulative Impacts Law. In our Cumulative Impacts Law, it actually doesn't leave it up to the Department of Environmental Protection to stop pollution in our neighborhoods. We are drawing the lines of what does it mean to be an environmental justice community. And if you're an environmental justice community in New Jersey, which is dictated by race and class, right? Very important, because we're seeing that lack in the federal government. If you are a community that is 35% low income, or 40% people of color, or 40% non-English speaking, then you're an environmental justice community, and an extra level of review is triggered. With that extra level of review, a site has to prove that they're not going to contribute to the pre-existing pollution, because the law is recognizing that environmental justice communities are overburdened. So if you're going to bring in a facility and it's going to add to that, then your permit shall be denied. And that shall instead of a may is what makes the biggest difference. We see time and time again, think tanks write policies that just dictate the studying of a problem, environmental impact statement, right? An analysis, but not actual decision. We need to put decision-making into communities' hands. We need to strengthen the way that community engagement happens when it comes to the siting of toxic facilities. And that's why this bill that was really passed by Ironbound Community Corporation, the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, and our partners at Clean Water, it was led by Environmental Justice Group. We did not let think tanks and people that thought they knew better ahead of us. And honestly, we were told for years, for a decade, that this law was not passable. It just was incompatible with industry. And so we've been able, since the environmental justice law passed, to kind of have a momentum of wins to push back industry. Recently, we've fought back a sludge plant, another power plant. Our neighborhood already has 3 power plants, and we were under attack with our 4th. We are constantly watchdogging Title V permits. We're right now in a lawsuit against the EPA to try to rewrite, to get EPA to strengthen their incinerator standards. It's just a laundry list of policy work that our organization does from the neighborhood level. I'm a member of the White House the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And through that, I've been really able to see just the influence of environmental justice on this current administration. It's been incredible, first off, that the WEJAC is actually made up of environmental justice leaders throughout the country, right? It's not like other FACAs where industry also has a say. That shows the power and influence of environmental justice as a movement. We're about 30 years old. A lot of our organizations and communities have been fighting for much longer than that, but it's been incredible to see the mainstream really acknowledge that if we're going to tackle climate, environment, we need to tackle racial and class, racial injustice and class injustice at the heart of it. And all that comes with that intersectional approach. Through that, we see that the Justice 40 is a direct response. It used to be called Environmental Justice 40, right? And what's incredible is that the environment was dropped to just call it Justice 40, so that it is a program that has more far-reaching, a more far-reaching span. And I think with Justice 40, there could be great influence from EJ, who knows that you can't just put flimsy guidelines in place. We saw that with opportunity zones that became gentrification zones. With Justice 40, we have a chance to really rewrite the way that the government distributes resources and make sure that people of color, who are about 40% of the population, get about 40% of resources and investment from all the different agencies. So that's work that we have to do. Every community organization should be engaged in, and we need funders to really help us fund that capacity. You should fund the capacity at the community level. Often that capacity is being given to intermediaries to then assist us. And I tell you, as someone that's tried to work with consultants and intermediaries, it's a lot of work. You're putting a lot of work on the grassroots group to make us work with others to really teach them. At the end of the day, all the think tanks come back to our community groups to really ask us how things work. And so we're not giving the recognition and respect that we deserve when it comes to policy. And we saw that impact in the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act was not a climate bill. It was something that needed to happen. But the ways that we sold out communities, that we sold out the environment, it's not a price. If you ask communities, was it a price worth paying? It was not a price worth paying. And we saw the great power of environmental justice through the stopping of the side deal. That side deal that Manchin was proposing would have created a rubber stamping process for fossil fuel companies. And communities stood up. Communities forced senators that would otherwise, I'm very proud that in New Jersey, a lot of our delegations stood up against the side deal, senators that would otherwise have gone silent. And that's why we need to empower community-based organizations, that we need to empower the grassroots, so that at the end of the day, all the policy work is to see lived conditions on the ground, material conditions of communities change. And so we need those communities at the table so that they can say, no, yes, that's a price worth paying, that's a price not worth paying. And so that we don't have to put all this effort into trying to correct false solutions like so many that are included in the Inflation Reduction Act. I would love to just work proactively and not reactively. And that comes with changing the way that we do funding, centering those closest to the problem and really trusting and equipping them with the right tools and expertise and resources so that they can make the difference. We've been making an incredible difference without a lot of resources. When we have more resources in the grassroots, I feel confident that we're going to accelerate the pace of change. So thank you for listening, and thank you. I hope you fund the grassroots because at the end of the day, we really deliver, and we deliver long-lasting change, not a photo op or a press release. We really do things that make a difference for a long time and for generations. Thank you.
So I want to thank Khan and Maria for like really getting us started in like what is possible, right? The idea of taking community values, community vision, and community's response to the harms they are feeling or the crises that they're feeling in terms of environment and climate change, and putting those into practical initiatives that can be implemented in different ways across communities. So I thank you both for like just opening up and sharing those examples those examples, and thinking about what it is to both, like, hearing Khan and Maria, like what it takes to sort of build the political power and political muscle to do the work that needs to be done, both from the practical sense of here's what's happening in our communities, here's the response we need, but also thinking about, like, here is then how we engage the political system to also meet the needs that we're suggesting, whether that is both with elected officials or running for office, or like getting in those spaces, to also holding accountable the agencies that are supposed to be holding this work around protecting the communities. And that has taken sort of both, like, hey, this is what we need to have happen in the communities, but then also, what it takes to like hold those agencies, those political spaces, those elected officials accountable to making that happen. And so you're seeing here then the sort of real practical applications of that with these two examples. We have more examples coming, but I think, one of the things that I was just reflecting on and hearing in the sharing is, like, what are the conditions that one made it necessary to move the way people had to move, both in sort of cumulative impacts, the threats and harms that were happening. What does that look like, those conditions? And also the conditions of what did it take for the community groups to be able to hold and move what they needed to move, right? And so some of that was developing some muscle, some of that was like, this is just what we're going to have to do. And some of it also, like I heard from both of them, is the sort of realization that this kind of work, this kind of accountability work and moving action around policy can happen with grassroots communities, right? That they're doing that work, they're making it happen without a lot of like policy think tank wonky kind of stuff, but just like, hey, this is really what the harm is happening, and this is how we think it should be fixed, right? They're just coming from very practical spaces to be able to do that. And I think that's a lesson to be learned, and this is thinking about like that as a possibility, in addition to some of the other policy spaces that are happening, that there's also value in listening and hearing from, this is a practical way that this can help us more directly. This is what we want to see happen because this is a direct response to the harms we're experiencing. And this is how we think agencies should respond, government officials should respond. And so I just really appreciate like hearing that from both of them, both Khan and Maria, about like how to make that happen. So I want to move to our next speaker and invite them to, oh wait, no, we have a poll. We have a poll. So I'm going to pass to Mark real quick to see if we can like get y'all to like interact a little bit. And so here is a poll question for you all. What percentage of your policy related grants go directly to grassroots and frontline groups? So there's some percentages there. What is specific to your group, just your organization, your foundation, to include that here, and look forward to seeing those poll questions. Do we want to wait for the poll, or are we going to share the results later?
Let's keep it open for now, and we can keep the conversation going. We have about 50% who have participated so far. So if you haven't yet, feel free to, and I'll close this once we get a little bit more critical mass. We'll
share the results with you a bit later, y'all. So I'm going to move us on to have Basav join us, and Basav will introduce himself and share a little bit more with us.
Thank you so much, Benishi, and huge thanks to the Climate Justice Alliance for having the vision to organize this briefing series and for inviting me to share my thoughts. So my name is Basav Sen. I'm the Climate Policy Director at the Institute for Policy Studies. We are a small policy organization that works in very close alignment with grassroots and frontline social movements. And I have the difficult task of being the bearer of bad news for the most part, after hearing about the amazing grassroots victories that the Oregon Just Transition Alliance and Ironbound Community Corporation have won in Portland and then statewide in Oregon and in New Jersey, respectively. So as you all know, environmental justice communities have for the longest time faced the onslaught of dirty, polluting energy, fossil fuels, and so on. But now, communities are facing fresh threats in the form of what we call false solutions, which are in direct contradiction with principles of what we term a just transition. So let me walk you quickly through the principles of a just transition that the Climate Justice Alliance works with. And I encourage you to look at the website to learn about all of them. I'm not going to talk so much about all of them. I'll just, highlight a few. Moves us towards buen vivir, or living well, but not at the expense of others. And that's kind of a bedrock principle of environmental justice, which is that no community should be a sacrifice zone. And that's not NIMBYism. That's not saying we shouldn't be a sacrifice zone, but no one should be a sacrifice zone. And that's what we find embodied in the powerful environmental justice law that Maria spoke about that they passed in New Jersey. That is a step in the direction of eliminating sacrifice zones. Creates meaningful work. We heard Khan talk about the career pipeline for people from communities who have forever been excluded from good jobs to actually be able to work in the new clean energy economy being created through the Portland Clean Energy Fund. And then one more principle I want to talk about: redistributes resources and power. And once again, the Portland Clean Energy Fund provides an excellent example of you're literally taking resources from powerful, wealthy retail corporations and distributing it to communities for projects that communities need. And you're not just distributing money, you're also providing communities with the power to create their own energy efficiency and renewable energy solutions for their own benefit. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. Yes, so false solutions at a fundamental level go against every one of these principles of a just transition. So for instance, they continue to poison, displace, and imprison communities. An excellent example is nuclear energy, which is often advertised as carbon-free, so a solution to climate change. Well, guess what? Uranium mining and processing and nuclear reactors and nuclear waste disposal are all extremely toxic and hazardous operations that disproportionately harm indigenous communities and other frontline communities. False solutions reduce the climate crisis to a crisis of carbon. Excellent example, carbon offset programs, where you say that, okay, there's this oil refinery here, and it's producing greenhouse gas emissions. But don't worry, those greenhouse gas emissions or the equivalent of them are being sucked out of the air by that forest over there. Well, but then what happens to the communities living adjacent to the refinery who still have to breathe the carcinogenic benzene that's being emitted by the refinery? So clearly there's a deeper environmental crisis here that's about more than carbon that the offset failed to address. False solutions extract and further concentrate wealth and political power. Excellent example being the so-called carbon capture and storage that's being sold from the federal to the state level and by the private sector all over the US right now. They allow big polluting facilities, big utilities to keep polluting just as they always did, and to keep having that same concentrated economic power without fundamentally changing their business model just by this techno fix. And one other feature of false solutions I want to mention that's not on the slide, which is that they don't address the root causes. Excellent example, solar radiation management, where you shoot aerosols like sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere to block out the sun, while not doing anything to address the fossil fuels and corporate agriculture and other drivers of the climate crisis. So really, false solutions contradict the principles of a just transition. They exacerbate sacrifice zones. They continue to concentrate power and resources instead of distributing them. They continue to create livelihoods that are hazardous instead of creating good, dignified work, and so on. So with that, the next slide, please. Yes, so the Climate Justice Alliance has been actively fighting false solutions. And I'll provide two examples. One is that we've come up with a series of fact sheets. Here you see an example called Hacking the Planet. It's an introduction to geoengineering, which includes solar radiation management that I talked about. It includes ocean fertilization. It includes carbon capture and storage, which we include within the family of geoengineering. And then also we have collaborated with a number of other organizations to reissue a popular education zine called Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, which provides an excellent, very practical and comprehensible breakdown of what are false solutions and what are real solutions to the climate crisis. And the next slide, please. And with that, I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all, and I'll pass it back to Benishi. Thank you.
Thank you, Basav. You shared lots of important information, and I'm sure we're going to continue to get more questions. But before we get to the questions, we're going to have Baganga join us, and she will introduce herself and share some more insights on this topic.
Hey folks, I'm having trouble with my camera, so I'm going to have to be off camera. I'm so sorry about that. So hunga arka banganga ng naka bangawi, hunga ataka agnatrama, naka kirstenuak pas, and I'm with IEN. I wanted to start off with a panel statement that was read by the folks that you see in the picture here, the Arctic Ice Protectors. This was an action that was held in Menlo Park, California. And let's see, Their statement is, as a society, we have forgotten how to be in relationship with one another. The United States of America has erased and enacted genocide upon indigenous peoples since 1492 and the stealing and enslavement of Black peoples from Africa. We acknowledge whose native lands we stand upon as a first step in relearning how to be in good relationship with one another. Right now, I'm on Dinaina lands. Climate change solutions are not those of preventing sea ice loss, mitigating sea rise level, or refracting sunlight back into the atmosphere. What Western science is focusing on are the effects of climate change, running to the next emergency, attempting mitigation, not meeting the threshold, and starting the cycle all over again. Anyone who is in good relationship will tell you that solutions must be local and community-led. They do not lie halfway across the globe, but in your relationship with your neighbor, local organizations, and most importantly, the indigenous peoples on whose land you reside. Indigenous communities who are least responsible for carbon emissions are the first to experience the impacts of global warming, yet are currently leading the fight for real climate change solutions. Those who are most responsible for expediting our extinction with false solutions meet up regularly and to agree on extremely reckless policies that use language such as net zero emissions and nature-based solutions that we recognize as cheat codes to continue with business as usual. A cap and trade carbon market that allows for carbon offsets funnels down to greenwash disaster capitalism, resulting in what we are seeing plainly as making profits from the climate disaster. Indigenous peoples' bodies and homelands have been treated as sacrifice zones at the expense of Western science and its respective advanced technology for decades. All of this is done without free, prior, and informed consent, and in the US is done without following federal guidelines for meaningful consultation with tribes. For example, one of these research projects, and one of the reasons that I'm speaking today, is the Arctic Ice Project, born from Leslie Field's Ice 9/11 project. This project was created without free, prior, and informed consent, and it proposes to spread harmful, toxic, synthetic silica microsphere beads on the living sea ice. This is an attempt to reflect sunlight back into the atmosphere with the intent to thicken or slow sea ice melt with human-made force. Projects like this are developed in universities far from areas of their intended use. The Arctic Ice Project, for instance, was originally developed at Berkeley and MIT, nearly an entire hemisphere away from the Arctic. The research group is already testing, and they began outdoor testing in Utkalvik, Alaska, without any tribal government consultation and without free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples who are directly impacted. The testing phase began with Ice 9/11, and the group since rebranded itself as Arctic Ice Project, and now they are able to claim that their nonprofit has never conducted any field testing because they're a different name. Their current research is still based on the testing that was already conducted on indigenous lands. A project without meaningful consultation and free, prior, and informed consent does not consider the concerns and expertise of the indigenous peoples who have been in relationship with their land since time immemorial. Our demand to uphold federal responsibility of meaningful consultation of federally recognized tribes and UN Indigenous rights standard of free, prior, and informed consent is not an argument to be construed into debate, but very real concerns for our immediate health, safety, and security of future generations' livelihoods. Proposals and tests to thicken sea ice and prevent ice melt by simply refracting sun rays are destined to fail. Western science needs to understand the interconnection between all of our systems. You cannot place man-made synthetic silica onto the ice for a single purpose of preventing ice melt without negatively impacting every system that depends on the sea ice freeze and melt cycle. This understanding is the basis for traditional ecological knowledge that has been passed down, practiced, and adapted since time immemorial by indigenous peoples. Testing whatever material will help thicken ice or slow ice melt with a simplistic, one-dimensional research question in a complex, multi-dimensional environment is short-sighted and misses the larger picture. For example, the sea ice is a living system that requires sunlight. The living sea ice system is a critical component within the complex living Arctic. Each component thrives harmoniously with the marine mammal and plant life, indigenous peoples, as well as the lands, lakes, mountains, rivers, and airways across the globe. In addition, silica is toxic. It's known by many researchers, laborers, and organizations to be toxic. As stated by the US Center for Construction Research, it only takes a small amount of airborne silica dust to create a health hazard. When inhaled, silica damages the lung tissue, causing inflammation, leading to health complications such as silica tuberculosis, silicosis, and other lung complications and autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis. Let me see. For more context, it is imperative that our societies know the acts of erasure that have and are occurring to Indigenous people so it doesn't continue to occur and never happens again. Indigenous peoples' lands and bodies have been guinea pigs for Western science and without free, prior, and informed consent required for meaningful collaboration. Examples include iodine injections to test survivability in the Arctic, radiation storage in the tundra from Project Chariot to understanding the effects of radiation on human bodies, and now this false solution to climate change known as Arctic Ice Project. So it's taking a bit longer than I thought it would to get through this. I tried to speed up, but I was told I was speaking too quickly. So I'm going to skip over some stuff. And just talk a little bit about what happened in Menlo Park. So the research group operates basically on private funding, and they had a fundraiser which we purchased tickets to. Those tickets were rejected, and we were told that they were full. And then some non-native allies purchased tickets and were permitted into the event. Inside the event, people were heard saying things such as Indigenous peoples are simple-minded and they don't understand science. We heard that they are testing on animals, and they showed slideshows of the tests that had been done both outdoors and in labs. And so projects like this are funded usually by fossil fuel interests. So Leslie Fields, for instance, used to work for Chevron for about 20 years. And projects like this usually result in what are called carbon credits or carbon equivalent credits. You know, if they're, a lot of them are hazardous to health and they're tested on Indigenous lands, essentially without free, prior, and informed consent. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of messages here. So I'll just wrap it up. Indigenous peoples who have lived with Mother Earth and Father Sky since time immemorial understand the cycles Earth goes through along with the incredible force she wields. It would be an immense failure by Western scientists to believe they could thicken ice with human force while failing to get to the root of this climate disaster. We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground, transition to renewable energies, and reevaluate our relationship with capitalism. Multi-generational place-based learning equips tribal communities with a wealth of knowledge unmatched by Western structured academia. And I'll just pause there. Thanks.
I want to thank you, Baganga. There's a lot of information to share, and you know, it's clear from both you and Basav, like there's a lot of technical expertise that even exists in our own community. So I thank you for trying to share as much as you could, given the time constraints. But we're going to have more time for questions, and I think you'll have some time to share it more. I'm going to pass now to Jackie. But I thank you both for your comments so far. Jackie?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So my name is Jacqueline Patterson. I am the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. We were founded on July 1st of 2021. And we work, as the tagline says, with Black frontline climate justice leadership. And we also work with, well, our four kind of buckets of work are community building, movement building, bending the mainstream arc towards equity and justice, and Black Pham well-being. So our work is really centered around building the capacity of frontline communities, as we said. So the community building is really the core of the work. Then movement building is as communities build up, then the larger context for systems change happens in that movement building context. And then the bending the mainstream arc is to actually at least mitigate the harms that can be done by the mainstream. And then in best case scenario, actually having powerful relationships that together we can work together to advance change. And then the Black Pham well-being support is recognizing that Black femmes, Black women are often the folks who are holding, whether it's their families, their organizations, their communities, the movement writ large, and even democracy in the case of certain situations that, as we saw in Alabama and Georgia. So recognizing that, we want to make sure that well-being is centered when we're holding our leadership. We've lost too many to not being held by the movement in the way that needs to happen. So that's our work in a nutshell. We do work around research and policy, organizing, popular education, and so forth. So that is that's the Chisholm Legacy Project. So now that you've heard a lot from my co-panelists about frontline struggles and victories, as well as the challenges, including the threat of false solutions that was so well described, we're now going to kind of bring it all together and talk about the immense collective power of the grassroots and why it's critical to invest in the concerted movement to advance systems change. There's so many climate solutions that are being proposed. It can be hard to separate the real and the true from the deceptive and the false, from carbon capture to carbon removal to natural gas to the anti-nature-based solutions, to cumulative impact policies, local food projects, local energy projects, and local small batch manufacturing. The ideas are so many, and with false solutions abounding, even with the names that can lead us down the path to injustice if we take them at face value, these are so many to be able to kind of sort through and figure out what's good and what's right. And so to help to demystify and illuminate people-led solutions, a few years ago, the Climate Justice Alliance worked with other groups within the It Takes Roots formation to develop the People's Solutions Lens. The People Solutions Lens provides 4 simple questions that we can ask ourselves to easily discern real solutions that work for people and planet from false solutions that continue to harm communities. And those questions are: who makes the decisions? Who benefits? What and whom else will this impact? And how will this build or shift power? So it reminds me of a poem that was written by the spoken word artists Lixa and Naima, who comprise climbing poetry. They wrote in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy and in referencing the inequities in the recovery. So some of the lyrics of their song, of their spoken word were: who is paying the price and who gets paid? Who is doing the rebuilding and whom are they building for? So these are the kinds of questions that they pose in the spoken word piece that I would highly recommend folks seeing if you haven't already. So with these questions providing a framework and foundation for action, frontline communities have won significant victories against polluting and extractive industries, preventing new emissions from reaching our atmosphere. From Randolph, Arizona, where an intrepid group of descendants of the founders of the Freedmen settlement in which they reside defeated the expansion of a gas plant, to the massive grassroots-led movement to defeat the Keystone XL pipeline. The grassroots are rising and the victories are mounting. So we're continuing our resistance to dirty energy infrastructure that's harming ecosystems, including people and communities. And we're building the local alternatives that center traditional, ecological, and cultural knowledge to create pathways for a regenerative future. So grassroots-led solutions are what's truly cooling the planet, and they are in an emerging abundance all around us. Local, tribal, and regionally based racial and economic justice organizations of Indigenous peoples, Black, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, and low-income white communities who share the legacies of racial and economic oppression and social justice organizing are already operationalizing just transition in our communities, putting clean energy infrastructure on the ground, moving policy, and centering climate justice. So you've heard some powerful studies from my co-panelists of policy wins from the local to the national level and visionary opposition to false solutions. In addition to these strategies, frontline communities are actualizing just transition on the ground by building the local, living, regenerative economy that we need. Examples are the community-controlled renewable energy projects being led by groups like the Local Clean Energy Alliance, Solidarity, Solar Holler, the Black Mesa Water Coalition, and beyond. Workforce development projects providing opportunities in the clean energy economy for formerly incarcerated persons, such as Homeboy Industries and Power 52. The relocalization of food systems, such as with groups such as Soul Fire Farm, Earthseed Collective, and beyond. Affordable housing with groups such as People United for Sustainable Housing. We all know Push Buffalo. The worker-owned cooperatives like Greystone Bakery, which supplies the awesome brownies that they use in the Ben and Jerry's ice cream mixes. Zero waste projects being led by groups like Zero Waste Detroit. Water equity solutions being led by groups such as We the People of Detroit and For the Love of Water, and so many more. These are just a minute handful of the climate actions that we are taking now. So I trust that you've heard, sorry, I'm in Costa Rica, a bug just crawled across my glasses. I am not a big bug person in spite of being an environmentalist. Anyway, I trust that what you've heard today is putting an exclamation point on what you've already seen from your vantage point in being supporters of environmental and climate justice work. But just to summarize, funding grassroots is a winning strategy. These are the projects and organizations that we need you directing money towards. We see the signs all around us of an escalating and intertwined set of crises in our times. This must be countered by an acceleration of money getting to the front lines who are both mired in high intensity struggles and simultaneously directing their passions and energy to building a just revolution anchored in real, lasting, durable solutions. Money that moves to the grassroots-led climate solutions and policy strategies now will be more impactful than money that moves 5 or 10 years from now. The rainy day that many foundations have been envisioning as the time to spend endowments and mobilize donor-advised funds is now. We are literally and figuratively in a monsoon season that is not ending until the grassroots are capacitated to advance real change at scale. Now is when we are building the solutions. Now is when we are crafting new economy systems. Now is when we need the support to deepen durability and scale impact and transformation. So thank you. And I'm going to pass it back to Benishi.
Wow, thank you for so much information. It's hard to even know where to start to sort of capture what has just been said. I mean, I think the journey we've just been through in the last few minutes with these last presenters, and for the whole panel really, is both like what is happening, the sort of assessment and the real deep assessment and technical information that is being shared around the sort of expertise that is both sort of localized expertise, but also like, you know, also skilled expertise in terms of like the science and the sort of applications of that and what is happening that does exist in our in our communities, and we need to have more of that as well, to really both assess like practically, like as the experts of the actual communities who are dealing with the harm, experts of the harm itself, and then also the additional sort of technical expertise as well to be shared there. And then what are the sort of practical solutions that are happening and the possibility of that. I think Jackie's brought us to this place of like, here are some sort of practical solutions that people are doing, and those things are moving with or without government support and with or without other support, but people are making that happen because it's necessary for their survival and existence. So, we're going to move into some questions here and see if we can like get through some of the questions that people have asked in the section here. We have a little bit less time than initially thought, but I think we're going to be able to get through this. So the first question that I have is, what are some of the approaches to convince legislators, particularly those who are more sort of centrist kind of folks? What is the approach and strategies used to convince them to lean more towards your work or to these strategies? So Khan, I think I'm going to bring this back to you. So the question is, what are some of the approaches to convince more center aligning legislators to support this work? Khan, do we have you there? There you go. Oh. Maria, would you be interested in checking in that question real quick? Or Khan, are you joining? Seem to have some technical difficulties with Khan right now.
Yes, I'll jump in while Khan figures out the technical difficulties. Yeah, it is difficult with center leaning elected officials, but I think what's important is always grounding our work in communities. At the end of the day, elected officials are elected by communities. So it is important for us to do our ground game. For us in Ironbound is one small neighborhood. It's not the whole city of Newark, right? We're not the whole district of any legislators, but we do so much work with other community-based organization in center-leaning districts, right? And we have really broad coalitions that don't just include community groups or environmentalists, but also social justice group, our social justice groups generally, but specifically racial justice groups, folks that care about economic justice. And we went around and for the EJ bill, we helped them all see how their interests were our interests, right? Like how our interests were aligned so that we can have enough of a broad coalition and really help the elected officials feel pressure from all sides. Like, wait, what is this group of people that don't usually, because if you have your housing advocates and you have a housing sign-on letter, it's always the same, 80 organizations. But we were able to really up the ante by having housing folks join us, communities from across the state. And I think that those types of cross-issue coalitions is really what helps the center move. The center's been moved a lot to the right. We need to move it back to the center so that people can feel free to stand with communities and then get rewarded for standing with communities. I think is very important so that they can see themselves in a new light and buy into a new vision.
Thank you. Khan, are
Can
you
folks
able
hear
to
me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Apologies for that. So folks can hear me right now? Okay, great. I don't know if I have an answer about centrist Dems. I think for me, I've been more focused on organizing my folks because I think for a lot of my organizing tenure, I have to admit that I was, in some ways, I think I was afraid of power. And I think because I was, had a I genuinely believe that all real power comes from communities. And so that has led me to stay away from electoral strategies that actually change who's making decisions. And so I would just say that our movement and our communities need to be pushing the boundaries, first of all, of what 501c3s are capable of doing. They can endorse ballot measure initiatives. They can give informational, educational, I think out of sometimes ignorance about what exactly we can do, we kind of shy away from it and let the tax code inform what we can and cannot do for our communities. And I think we need to be more savvy about that. So I'm more focused on really building with my folks who I do have political alignment with, and making sure that we are actually the ones running for office and making decisions, because I think what everybody responds to, I think, is power, and being able to show that we actually do have power by building our C4s, building, trying to flame.
I'm sorry, did we lose Khan? I think so. So we'll move on, and maybe Khan will join us later, but I think, she laid out some important points there for us to consider. And I think one other thing I'll just add to that is, even, there is a role to always maintaining a relationship with elected officials, both in accountability, but also in keeping them engaged and connected with community and with the information they need. And once, in the situation where people are getting elected to office, that we don't forget to continue to keep them educated about what's happening and what's important for the communities. So I'm going to move on to another question. Vasav, this is probably coming to you. So do panelists consider nuclear fusion energy to also be a false solution? Fusion doesn't pose the same risks that, that you were laying out earlier, Vasav, around nuclear fission energy, though none of this has really been tested at a retail level. So I want to see if you have any insights, Vasav, to share.
Thank you. Yes. And the short answer, I would say, is yes. And to understand why we consider that a nuclear fusion a false solution, we can refer back to our just transition principles. Nuclear fusion, which doesn't exist yet, but if it were to exist, it would be extremely capital intensive and centralized. Once again, concentrating resources and power in large corporations, utilities, and so on, instead of devolving power and resources to the grassroots level. So that's one concern. Another concern is one of the just transition principles is build what we need now, which means we need to start dismantling the dirty, polluting stuff that we don't need and replace it with what we have right now. And if we were to say, oh, let's wait for nuclear fusion to come online and pour research funding into a technology that honestly may never materialize, we are continuing to poison communities with dirty energy, and we are gambling on the future of the planet.
Thank you, Vasav. And just for others to know, we also tried to filter some of these initiatives through a series of questions to help us think through whether or not they're false solutions. So, just to share those questions with you all a little bit, what is the problem that the initiative is trying to solve? Whose interest does it serve, that particular technology or initiative? Who's calling for them and who's backing them? And then who are they engaging specifically in to account for, like, the harm that is being addressed through that initiative? And so those are the questions that we try to answer. And if the response to that is not, doesn't include frontline communities in the majority of the responses to those answers, then it's most likely a false solution. Anyway, that's just food for thought, for consideration. So I have another question here. So following up on the advice that you gave, Maria, around specific guidance to funders around funding beyond intermediaries, can you talk a little bit more about how funders should show up in their relationship with grassroots organizations they fund, particularly those funders who have policy staff or policy capacity they should be sharing? And we may come to another panelist as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm not sure if I was saying don't fund intermediaries at all, but I'm saying definitely don't. That shouldn't be the go-to. And I feel like that is the go-to when it comes to policy. It's like, who can help? The amount of times I've heard funders say, let me help you by giving them a big grant that then they'll work with you on. And so that just feels like real trickle down economics, especially when it comes to these big things like policy. Policy is expensive, right? Like policy staff. It's an expensive expertise. And so I think one thing is we need to up the amount of salary that we're giving grassroots organizations. For some reason, I have noticed a big disconnect in philanthropy that if it's for grassroots, I'm going to give that grant at a lesser amount because they don't know how to manage it, right? So it is setting us up for failure in that sense of we can't staff to the capacity we need. So then we end up overworking the folks that we do have. And that's not fair, right? Because the folks that work at grassroots organizations are driven by passion and commitment to their communities. I think if foundations have policy staff, what does it mean to really be in true partnership? But more than partnership, take the lead from the grassroots organization. That's one thing we did in the environmental justice law is we asked everybody with more expertise, with relationships to elected officials, to stand behind us, not just with us, but behind us. And what that meant to really show that you trust the leadership of the grassroots organization that's leading in the area or the issue area that most directly impacts them, right? So have your staff follow the leadership of that grassroots organization. Instead of being like, oh, this, sometimes we create a condescending power dynamic of like, I'm here to help you. And we really need to break that apart and recognize the different roles that we each have to play and center grassroots experience and boots on the ground as true expertise that's necessary for any successful policy equation.
Any of the other panelists want to, give any guidance to funders about how to support this policy work with folks, Paganga or others? You don't have to, just. No one else. I think we'll go on to the next question. Can we share strategies for connecting our movements for climate justice in the global South? Maybe I'll try to answer that real quick. So, Climate Justice Alliance has a couple of members who are grassroots-centric funder intermediaries. They're organizations that are in relationship with grassroots groups, but also try to move money to organizations and communities in the global South. So Thousand Currents, Grassroots International, we're happy to share more information with you about that. And another question that came up is about the conditions in other countries, and that's a longer discussion to be had, and we can check in about that a little bit more, and might have to do more one-on-one conversations, or maybe even we might consider another series of presentations to have at a later point. And I want to just say one of the other things to think about in this right now is, we've talked about local state policy, what's been happening, how that is related to the federal policy and what is happening, and some strategies that people have used around that. But there's also what is happening on an international level. And many of the panelists here have participated in the past and will be participating coming up in the UN space around climate change and the upcoming COP that is happening in Egypt, COP 27. And this is a space where, there is sort of international discussions and negotiations happening around policy that'll be implemented across the country, across many countries or all the countries. And so, our role always has been to, one, lift up frontline voices, to make sure that frontline community-centered grassroots solutions are being lifted up. Two, that we're countering the influence of the polluting industries on the delegations that are deciding what is happening. And two, to hold our elected officials accountable to grassroots communities, both accountable to grassroots communities in the US, but also accountable for harms that are being caused by corporations and policies in the US that cause harms in the global South. And so that's coming up here soon, but it's also another space where we have to, one, continue to develop and exercise our muscle to be able to hold, the discussions, the panels, and sharing of the information so that the delegations can engage in those spaces in ways and advocate for the communities coming up. One of the main themes coming up is around loss and damage. And what does that mean for communities, and what does that mean for things like reparations, and how are resources going to be distributed, and what does that look like, and what does it look like from communities? And there's a lot of complexity to that. There's lots of things to sort of work through and figure out. And I think that's where we're at right now is, looking at how are we continuing to connect what's happening globally with what's happening locally, and all the space in the middle with states and national and federal policy work. And this is the challenge before us, but it's also the work that those on the panel, those who are engaged in climate change work, are deep, their elbows deep into this work, and have been, many for decades, have been way deep into this work and holding it. And so I just wanted to share that, and thank you all for being here and for hearing this, and to know that there's still lots of work ahead of us, and we may even have more of these going forward, and we'll figure out what that will look like. But if you have any more direct questions or specific things you want to ask, contact us here on this slide here. You can reach out to Mark. But I think our panelists, Khan, Maria, Basav, Paganga, Jackie, I thank you all for your expertise. I thank you all for your heart and for all of the work that you're doing. And I thank you all who have joined us on this webinar to hear this and to learn, and to be in the willingness to learn and move forward with us in good ways. So I thank you all. You have a good afternoon, a good evening, and look forward to reconnecting with each of you soon.